And it looks like we have some breaking news out of Alaska where NBC News projects, oh my gosh, a Democrat just won the special congressional election? Beating out Trump's pick, Sarah Palin? I just learned that reading that off the prompter. Wow. All right.
Stand up.
From a defabricated garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA, this is Stand Up with Pete Dominic. On today's episode, Top 5 Ways to Contribute to the Office Zoom Hootenanny. And now, the podcast host who has the largest hootenanny rolling around in his brain, Pete Dominic!
That is accurate as always, my friend. I do have quite a hootenanny going on up there right now. I mean, they are square dancing, drinking moonshine. What am I talking about? Hello, folks. Welcome to the show. I'm very happy to have you. I have two awesome guests. Both of these guests are first-timers. Neither of them have ever been on this show, the old show, the new show, or I've never talked to either one of them until I did today. So very happy to share my conversations with both Victor Ray, who is a professor of sociology at University of Iowa, has written a really important new book about race and critical race theory, which is fascinating. And for the first time ever, activist Melissa Byrne joins us to talk about how she was one of the original planters of the seed on college loan forgiveness, takes on all the arguments. Very, very good conversations with the both of them. I think you are going to love them. Also, welcome to September, folks. I am taping this on September Eve. I'm very happy that we are here. I'm kind of generally happy wherever we're at. I love seasons changing and transitions as hard as they can be. I do love this time of year. It has been very hot. Shout out to those in California that are dealing with some ridiculous temperatures right now out there, apparently. Also, it is Thursday night, which means we will hang out. Stand Up subscribers, meet me tonight at 8 p.m. I'll be in the shed. You'll be where you are, and we will Zoom hang out. It's always a lot of fun. If you've never joined us, sign up right now. Go to standupwithpete.com just to join the party. $5 a month. You get to come every Thursday night, and you're supporting this podcast. You'll make friends. You'll build a network. You'll laugh. You'll learn. It's always awesome. We have special guests tonight, Thursday nights, 8 p.m. East, and you can always hang out on the Discord platform if you're a subscriber as well. Do want to answer a couple responses or comments on yesterday's show. I did a very long kind of segment covering fascism and a couple of other news stories, and it was like 30 minutes or so, and Pete Olsky, longtime listener, said, Pete, I've been listening for years, and I am a Patreon subscriber. You're as good as anyone for long-form interviews with interesting guests discussing interesting topics. Your podcast is one of the very few places for this type of interview. It's your A-game, your strong point. But you're backsliding by doing what everybody else does, a bunch of unrelated news snippets, reading tweets. This morning, 32 minutes went by before SE Cup interview started. You're starting your show with trivial items I can get all day long anywhere. I finished breakfast, drove across town to work while listening, and still never got to the conversation with SE Cup until I sat at my desk. I say, don't fill time with stuff I can find anywhere. At least cap it at 10 minutes. Just get to what you do best. Long-form interviews. I don't need tweets, news bits, or silly songs. On our end, we have so much time in the day to listen. Love your show. I listen daily. Just go right for the good stuff. Forget the pablum everyone else is doing. Pete, I hear you. I think I'm going to meet you in the middle of the comment from Dr. David Quartwell, who said, I love the new news format. Your news focus and directed coverage on important issues is great. Your analysis is very welcome. I like your monologue interpretations. People listen to you. Thank you very much, David. And so I don't know where you stand, somewhere in between. How about we try to just do 10 minutes, a few clips, see how that goes for a few shows, a few days. But let me know what you think, and I'm going to start putting out some polling for listeners to be more specific. And I totally hear Pete and anybody else, but also do want to give a shout out to those who did listen to the entire 2-hour show yesterday. I asked for those at the end of the show. If you listen to the whole thing, let me know. So shout outs to Mandy Hansen, Will Powers, Tanya Mertland, and I feel like a couple of other people told me, and I'm forgetting now. But you guys, thank you very much for reaching out to me and letting me know that. I really appreciate it. Email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. Any of your thoughts about how to contribute to the show, make it better. You'll see see I'm putting out some more video clips, and I'm going to be ramping that up a lot. All right, lots to come, but let me give you just a few clips from yesterday that I thought were relevant, good, important. You may have heard them. We'll just do a few. We'll see what happens. A lot of people were very excited about Serena Williams winning last night at the U.S. Open. Of course, she announced her retirement earlier this year, but she came from behind and beat the number 2 player at the tournament. This is what it sounded like last night in Queens.
Their first meeting is a memorable one. Serena Williams just supreme in the final set when she had to be. Rolling back the years. Vintage. The underdog in this match tonight. She just absolutely grabbed it away from the number 2 player in the world.
Oh, man, exciting. I mean, who did you have to be and how much was it to get a ticket for Serena Williams' match last night, the one before that, or any of the ones coming up? And, you know, it's New York, richest people in the world, big tennis fans, a lot of celebrities, you know, just normal people who pay $27 for a 12-ounce bottle of Poland Spring. Anyway, Serena Williams winning and Sarah Palin losing in Alaska's special election last night made a whole lot of people who think or feel a certain way about the way the world should work and their moralities, I suppose you could say their politics, happy last night. That was another piece of news, of course, last night. Sarah Palin losing, which is a very, very big deal last night in a special election in Alaska, of all places. And also last night on the last day of August, Stacey Abrams in Georgia wants to be the governor, where Brian Kemp is the governor, and they debated. And there's a rematch coming up in November. But man, this clip went viral last night because Stacey Abrams broke the heel of her shoe off in Brian Kemp's ass. And man, you gotta hear it. This is wild. Brian Kemp accuses Stacey Abrams of committing voter fraud at the debate, and her response leaves Brian Kemp naked and shitting his pants on stage.
Question is, why are you encouraging people to break the law for you in this election?
Mr. Kemp, you are very aware that I know the laws of Georgia when it comes to voting. In fact, I am one of the foremost experts in the state on expansion of voting rights. And I have never in my life asked for anyone who is not legally eligible to vote to be able to cast a ballot. What I've asked for is that you allow those who are legally eligible to vote to allow them to cast their ballots. And in fact, we took you to court in 2016, and a federal judge said that you illegally canceled 34,000 registrations. You use the exact same system, the exact match system that is under dispute right now. Now, I realize that in the next response, you're going to say that it's a function of my organization because your tendency is to blame everyone else for the mistakes that you make. My responsibility as a leader is to see a problem and try to solve it. When I saw that we had 800,000 unregistered people of color in the state of Georgia, I started an organization that has reached into every county and increased those registrations. When I saw that people were being unlawfully denied the right to vote, I worked to make certain that we held you accountable. And as the next governor of Georgia, I will continue to do my job to make certain that every legally eligible vote that gets cast gets counted.
Ms. Abrams, thank you.
Oh, boy. Oh, did you hear the chart? Did you hear it? What did you think of that? Whew. It's organized for Stacey Abrams in Georgia. While we're down there in Georgia, let's check in with Herschel Walker, who was asked by a reporter yesterday. He's running for Senate, of course, in Georgia. And he was asked about women's issues and what he thought women were concerned about. And he said, you know, women go to the grocery store, and so probably groceries. Oh, God.
So, you know, you're discussing women's issues this week. What are some of the things that are kind of on top of your mind when you're thinking of women's issues?
Well, I love them to address that since they're women, so they can do it a little better than I can. But I think, you know, there's no doubt crime is very, very important. And this economy is tough because they got to buy groceries. And I think all the inflation, the gas prices, the grocery prices.
This economy is tough because they got to buy groceries. I mean, someone needs to tell Herschel Walker everybody buys groceries. Matter of fact, my daughter and I went to a Trader Joe's yesterday. We don't have one near me, but we were in New Jersey picking up my broken down car, which is somehow still working. Went to Trader Joe's and I saw types of people in there. Old people and young people, women and men, and black and white and Asian and Hispanic. I don't know. There's all types in there. Everybody likes that Trader Joe's. I thought it was really weird when they're like, sir,
You can't check out here. You're a man. I thought that was pretty offensive that they did that. But other than that, no surprises. I got some good items, including some delicious blueberries, but not before I dropped the entire container, which is embarrassing because when blueberries fall, they really kind of roll around all over the goddamn. It's on my hands and knees picking up blueberries. Like, sir, we'll do that. I'm like, I got it. I mean, seriously, it's not like dropping a jar of ketchup. Oh, that's a terrible mess. We'll get somebody to mop it up. When you drop blueberries, like the entire store is affected. Every person was about to step on a blueberry. It was terrible. Anyway, the other big news last night and all day yesterday, of course, was everybody in all of media and legal circles analyzing the photo of top secret classified information and, of course, making fun of it as well, because you saw this breaking overnight. The FBI put out, I guess it's the FBI, a photo of what Trump had. I mean, law enforcement always does this, by the way, right? When they seize drugs or guns, whatever, they take pictures. And so it's not that normal. What's not normal is it's the former president of the United States who had these files apparently in his desk. I mean, you've heard a lot of the analysis about it, but I thought this was a really interesting, maybe 2 minutes or so. Okay, this is from Chris Hayes last night. He throws to Fox News where Karl Rove, of all people, tells Martha McCallum they weren't his documents. Then Chris Hayes comes back with some great analysis and throws to George Conway, who has some really interesting thoughts. I just thought this whole little segment was worth sharing with you. It seemed like a whole lot of people, not including the usual suspects, were actually saying they really thought Donald Trump might get indicted over this crime. We'll see, but here it is.
So here's Karl Rove just laying out the fact that they do not belong to him. Take a listen.
The DOJ is investigating, and the Trump side has their lawyers and their feelings about what was rightfully his and able to take. But it's just interesting.
Let's be clear. Let's be clear on this. None of these government documents are his to have taken. I agree with the deputy director who said that a lot of the former president's problems are of his own creation. You can, under the Presidential Records Act of 1978, you cannot take original documents out of the White House with you when you leave the White House, whether you're the president of the United States or any of his aides. No, it's verboten under the law.
So the point there that Rove says they're not his and they brought him on himself, that is the craziest thing about all this. I have watched him do all kinds of things, previous life and public life, where he seemed either to be breaking the law or flirting with breaking the law. And he encouraged Russian sabotage, criminal sabotage the election, right? Cheered it on. He attempted to blackmail a foreign leader using U.S. foreign policy into dirty tricks against his opponent. He attempted the first ever essentially coup in the U.S. government history so he could stay in power. In all of those, the motives are clear. He didn't have to do this. It's so wild. He has brought this on himself by deciding to just hoard and steal a bunch of documents that weren't his and then lie about it.
And not only that, he could have given those documents back last year. And this would have been over.
Yes.
And it's incomprehensible. It's just his. I mean, he's a sociopath and he's a narcissist. I mean, he's a sociopath who knows no bounds, knows no rules, doesn't care about the rights of others, cares only about himself. But even if he, cared about himself, you'd think he'd know enough not to do this. But he doesn't. Exactly. He just can't help himself. He's just everything belongs to him. He is the center of his own universe. We are all abstractions to him. OK, we belong to him. The generals across the river at the Pentagon belong to him. Right. They were my generals. These documents are my documents. The presidency, it's mine. I get to keep it. Or if I don't get to keep it, somebody's stealing it from me. This is a deranged, defective personality and self-destructive to the core. And we're watching him self-destruct in real time.
Wow. How about that commentary? I thought that was really excellent. George Conway and Chris Hayes. I enjoyed that. Wanted to share it with you. All right, two more. Here is Judge Andrew Napolitano got washed out of Fox News for some kind of scandal. I forget, and I refuse to look it up. But dude is a conservative guy and also a former good friend of Donald Trump's. I think Trump threw him in the garbage for being critical of him on Fox News. Anyway, he had to go over and slum it at Newsmax with Eric Bolling, who looks like he got stung by quite a few bees. I don't know if you've seen him lately, but something's going on with his face, and I don't mind making fun of it because I have my personal issues with that guy when I worked with him at CNBC, and he's always been a terrible influence on people's minds. Anyway, Eric Bolling, Judge Napolitano, this is significant because the judge is like, I think he might get indicted. On Newsmax, he said that.
You wrote an op-ed saying that you believe there will be an indictment of the former president. Can you just tell us why you believe that?
Because I don't think the government would have gone through this without planning in advance to indict him. It pains me to say it, and I don't think he should be indicted. But I think the people that will make this decision have already made up their minds, and they'll make this presentation to the grand jury right after the midterm elections.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Judge, really appreciate you on and thank you for your time. And I'm going to hope you're wrong, but I understand you didn't want to say it, but you had to say it because that's you being honest with yourself.
Eric, I hope I'm wrong too. How many times have you heard me say that?
Yeah, exactly. So I also sometimes you say said another way. So maybe we'll find another way to say that. Judge Andrew Napolitano, thank you for joining.
I left that last part on because it was just so awkward. I know you didn't want to say it. By the way, how much does Judge Andrew Napolitano look and sound like Harvey Fierstein? Anybody be with me? All right. Finally, here's a new ad from Project Lincoln. You lose a little without seeing the images, but I wonder if you think this makes an impact. Do you share this with your Trump-loving friend, neighbor, or relative? But anyway, here it is, about a minute long. Touting Joe Biden's accomplishments and basically calling Trump a criminal who's going to be in an orange jumpsuit.
In the gridlock in Washington, inflation has been coming down and gas prices are plummeting. So after months of attacking Biden on these very issues, what can Republicans attack now? Simple. They go back to the classics, like crime, racist dog whistles disguised as police support and designed to stoke fear. A desperate attempt to distract. They don't know what to do when there's real leadership in Washington. But this old classic won't work, because it's hard to be tough on crime when your party leader is a criminal. A man who stole classified documents and lied to the FBI. And this was after he participated in an attempted coup. So go ahead, Republicans, get tough on crime. If you really want to prove you knew it, there's one criminal who's more than ready for his orange jumpsuit.
Whoa, what a ride. More than ready for this orange jumpsuit, I think the guy said. I don't think we're going to ever see him in jail or an orange jumpsuit. But I'd love to be wrong. Just like Eric Bolling wants Judge Napolitano. And I think Judge Napolitano said that too. I'd love to be wrong. Now, you're not wrong. You saw the pictures. By the way, one of the funniest tweets out there came again from the legend, my old friend Dan Rather, CBS News, Dan Rather reporting, CBS News. As others have noticed, can we talk about the carpet of Mar-a-Lago? Should that be added to the list of crimes? Talking about the carpet that we're all making fun of, that the files that were photographed were taken on some kind of a carpet, some room at Mar-a-Lago, and everybody's making fun of it. I think Josh Marshall even did a deep dive on where that carpet came from. I didn't read it. Speaking of tweets, I thought this was interesting. Amazing statistic. More Americans now smoke weed than cigarettes. How about that? 16% say they smoke pot compared to 11% with cigarettes. A few of my other favorite tweets. Comedian Jay Black, after Sarah Palin was announced that she'd lost. Mary Peltola, a Democrat, just won in Alaska, Jay tweets, beating the OG dum-dum Sarah Palin. Guys, I'm starting to think that stripping half the population of their bodily autonomy while also continuing to link themselves to a ketchup-tossing traitor may have been a misstep by the Republicans. Great tweet by Jay Black, at Jay Black is funny. Danielle Moody tweeting at D2 Cents says, we have officially entered the fuck around and find out portion of the year. First Kansas on abortion, now Alaska, let's go! Glenn Kirshner tweeted, after Trump's lawyers certified that everything had been returned to the government, the search of Mar-a-Lago uncovered tons of additional highly classified documents that it hadn't been returned, including classified documents in Trump's desk drawers. Hashtag indict Trump because hashtag justice matters. Glenn Kirshner. And speaking of which, Asha Rangappa said, don't Trump's attorneys, Bob and Corcoran, need to recuse themselves from Trump's team at this point? Hard to represent your client when you're now also a defendant. Charlie Savage, New York Times writes, Trump is so mad about the optics. People may not understand it was the FBI that spread out the files from Box 2A to take a standard evidence photo, that he's ignoring
He's ignoring the legal implications of him coming very close to acknowledging that he knew he had them in his office. Molly Jung Fast says about that, isn't this kind of semi-confessing? Like, maybe that's a play on semi-fascism. Noel Kasler tweeted at Noel Kasler, at Kasler Noel, summer was bookmarked by twin Trump crimes. We began June with the January 6 hearings and all the revelations of his White House coordinated putsch. Yet, as Labor Day approaches, we have his stealing of top secret documents. It's staggering to think that these are separate issues. What a criminal. All right, those are just a few of my favorite tweets. And now it's time to get to my guests. How about that? 20 minutes of sound and tweets. Too much? Do I need to tighten it up? What do you think? StandUpWithPete@gmail.com. I want you to be a producer of our show. Stand Up With Me. All right, getting so hokey, it's cringeworthy. Let's get to my first guest. Coming up, though, Melissa Byrne joins me. She is an activist and one of the OG activists on student loan debt. She worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign, very well connected in progressive activist circles. A great conversation with her. But first, I really enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Victor Ray, Professor Victor Ray is at the University of Iowa, and he's written a very popular new book that everybody's been talking about. It's titled On Critical Race Theory, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care. It's very readable, very informative, and very important. And Victor Ray is an interesting guy who grew up poor in Western Pennsylvania. His mom was white, his dad was black, but he passes for white, and that informs a lot of his life and his work. It's just a fascinating life experience. He's got a PhD, though, from Duke. He went to undergrad at Vassar, and his work has been published in a number of peer-reviewed journals, and of course he's a professor at University of Iowa, and he's been on a lot of really big podcasts already, including my friend Virginia Heffernan's Critical Pod. This is Critical, rather. This is her last episode was with Dr. Victor Ray. I was very happy to take that suggestion from her and have him on this show. I think you're really going to like it. We had a great talk before and then a really long talk after, so I can definitely tell you he'll be joining me again. So I hope you like this conversation. I hope you'll consider getting his excellent new book, On Critical Race Theory, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care. You should follow him on Twitter, where he's really active. Let him know that you heard him here on the show. Victor Eric Ray. You can link to it on Twitter. It's a little confusing. Eric with a K. I should have addressed that with him. All right, here we go. Thank you so much for joining me.
Of course. I'm happy to be here.
I think that I want to start with you. It matters a lot who you are, and you share your story in the book and in other places that you've appeared in media, on social media. But it's also important because apparently, critical race theory uses narratives and parables to prove a lot of the points of what real life is actually like. And you are a white passing, very light-skinned person from a mixed-race family whose parents were certainly considered black. And that gives you, before you become an academic, a lifetime of experiences for which you can share, and you do. Like, you got kidnapped once, apparently.
Well, at least that's what the people who called the police on my uncle thought, right? So terrible. I opened the book with a story that my uncle tells quite a bit about him taking me to a parade when I was 2 in downtown Pittsburgh. And, you know, as a loving uncle will do, he lifted me to his shoulders. Someone in the crowd saw us and called the police. And my uncle had to explain to the police that I was not, in fact, abducted, that I had been, that he was taking care of me. He was doing what uncles do to their nephews. And I point out in the book that wasn't the only time that happened to me. It also happened to me when I was playing in the yard with my father outside of the trailer I grew up in. Someone drove by and saw my dad chasing me around the yard and didn't assume they're playing catch. I mean, they're playing tag. They assumed that I was in danger.
You guys were playing tag, and so maybe your dad was chasing you. And they were like, "Oh my God, I must save this kid from his father."
I have to save this kid. I needed to escape, and the police needed to intervene in they intervened in our family relationship, right? So I think I write about this too, calling a sort of armed agent of the state to intervene in that way, given what we've seen around disproportionate police violence in the Black Lives Matter movement over the past couple of years is a real risk. I will say, when my dad talks about this, I was about 9 or 10. In that officer's defense, that officer was deeply embarrassed when he knocked on the door and my dad answered, and he described the situation, and my dad said that was my son playing with my son in the yard, and the officer just, my dad said the officer threw his hands up and walked away. So there's that. But yeah, those experiences sort of socialized me to how I was treated very differently in a lot of interactions when I was alone or I was with my mom, who's white. But they also showed me how sort of like the mundane interactions of Black folks can be interpreted very differently, or Black folks who are darker skinned can be interpreted very differently. And that can bring with it all kinds of dangers and all kinds of discrimination. And so I point out in the book that one of the things that a lot of critical race theorists do is they use narratives or personal stories to connect those individual experiences to larger patterns, right? So the pattern here of the police being called on Black men for taking care of their families is connected to racial profiling and mass incarceration, right? It's connected to racial stereotypes in the media about Black men not taking care of their families or being good fathers. And critical race theorists, so they use those stories to kind of provide an in. I think a lot of times when you're hearing about racial inequality in something like wealth or health, the sort of bombardment with statistics makes it hard to relate or makes it hard to understand. Yeah. And sometimes the personal angle of those stories can hit people's brains from a kind of different direction.
Yes. And I feel like what we have seen over the past few years, solely as the result of the fact that people have high-tech cameras in their pockets, everybody, and the instant ability to broadcast things, is we're seeing all the parables or narratives that are written about by, in this case, critical race theorists on YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, everything. We're seeing them. 2 nights ago, I think I watched a video of a guy being arrested in his own front yard because he looked like a suspect, Black guy. And we've all seen the violence, but you just listed a whole bunch of other consequences before any violence as a result of a misunderstanding, much less racial profiling. How have these videos, specifically, including obviously George Floyd, that was its own situation with police, how have these videos of the real misunderstandings, wrong guy, dude, just, there's all these phrases, walking your dog while Black, mowing your own lawn while Black, whatever it is while Black.
So, I write about this in the book, too. I use the example of a couple of police killings that were caught on video. And one of the arguments I make in the book is, as you're pointing out, that these, social media and the sort of instant access to this footage has actually confirmed narratives that were long existing within sort of communities of color in the United States about disproportionate police violence, and not only confirmed the disproportionate police attention on those communities, even if it doesn't result in this kind of violence.
Good nuanced point. Yes. So important.
And with this disproportionate attention, it can lead to violence, but this disproportionate attention was often not believed, right? So I think, if I tell folks the story about the cops being called on my dad or my uncle, and I'm often met with disbelief. If I tell white families, if I tell Black folks this, they're like, yes, of course, right? Like, yes, we know this happens. This is actually sort of a staple of historical tales about passing. Lots of Black folks have this experience of light-skinned members of their families. The other thing I'll say here is that in confirming this, it has created, I think, space for movements like we saw around George Floyd or some of the successes of the Black Lives Matter movement, because those narratives with the sort of evidence are much harder to deny. Now, I will also say it hasn't meant that like cops are necessarily prosecuted for these things, right? Because cops in a number of these cases have gotten off. But I do think it is harder to deny the sort of reality of your eyes in the face of these kinds of videos proliferating.
I always think when asking this point, and you like you just said, you write about it in the book, I think about how apparently, you can maybe help me out here, but apparently the beatings on the Selma Bridge in 1960 of Dr. King and John Lewis and others, those were televised. It was the first time that most Americans saw black people being abused that way. Not most black people saw, but the first time most Americans, certainly white Americans, actually saw it. And apparently that had a huge impact on changing public opinion, so much that the movement itself got momentum. And one could make the same point to some extent about Rodney King and George Floyd and any one of these other videos. But throughout history, we've seen these, but now they're just every day, Dr. Ray.
So, all right, so this is, I don't write about this in the book, so I'm gonna speculate on some things I know here,
okay.
Right? Or things.
Well, I'll get back to the book in a second, I promise.
But one thing that I think here in the case of sort of Selma or Dr. King, is that, the civil rights activists were brilliant strategists, and they knew they were creating scenes to show the United States, and I would say not just the United States, but the world. They knew that international pressure on the United States, especially during the Cold War, from the Soviet Union and the propaganda that the Soviet Union was making around racism in the United States was very effective. And so, the suits, the nonviolent direct action, the one thing I do write about in the book is the kind of respectability politics that sometimes led the movement to disregard the contributions of LGBTQ folks who were organizing.
Right.
They were strategic moves in order to advance the cause of civil rights. Now, I think mistakes were made, right? Sure. I think things were or could have been done very differently, but I do think they were very aware of the power of the media and the power of the kinds of photos that you're talking about. Now, that being said, I also am very cautious about photos of violence and attacks against people of color circulating. So I do not watch these when they're around. I have all of my browsers on to turn off autoplay, because early on I had autoplay on a couple of times and I saw things that I didn't need to see. What I worry about these is the history of lynching photos. And if you know anything about this, lynching postcards were super popular throughout the United States, and lynchings were a kind of white racist bonding ritual. And then these postcards circulated, and they were dehumanizing, they were degrading, and I don't think that they led to sort of a progressive place, right? Folks saw lynching not necessarily, some white Americans saw lynching not necessarily as an aberration, but as a kind of justice. And so when I think about these photos, I think the videos, they need to be contextualized, they need to be explained, and, that how they are interpreted is not necessarily always as straightforward as I think progressives would like to think.
Very well said. I love hosting this podcast, because that was something you can't get across in a tweet. And it's really important to get the nuance and hear your personal view on, how you see or handle these videos when they come up in your feed. Super important. The book is on critical race theory, why it matters and why you should care. A little bit about your scholarship before we get right into the book, because You're not one of the original founders of studying critical race theory, coming up with it. You've looked a lot of their work and interpreted it through many of your essays, and certainly, I'm sure, in your class there in Iowa. But where did you come on board? Where did you learn about critical race theory? Because we get to a point not too long ago where it became mainstreamed by being demonized, first through an activist named Christopher Rufo. I think we could start there, but then all the way to Donald J. Trump, who was president at the time, and started screaming about critical race theory. Where did you come to it? At what point in your career, in your scholarship?
Sure. So as an undergrad at Vassar, I took a class on critical race theory, and I read an article in which I actually have a chapter in the book based on this article.
Yep.
But from Cheryl Harris, called Whiteness as Property. And so one of the things this article does is it talks about the history of race and economic relations in the United States, starting with, Black people being held as property under the slave regime, and the history of theft of land from Native Americans, and what that has meant for things like the wealth gap, which stands at about 10-1 between white Americans and Black Americans in the United States, because those initial unequal conditions have compounded over time. And the reason this article spoke to me is something that we've already touched on. Cheryl Harris uses the example of her grandmother, who was a Black woman, light-skinned, that could pass as white, who was a sharecropper in Mississippi and then moved to Chicago, and found that when she moved to Chicago, she was still locked out of jobs and segregated in a Black community. And so she chose to, this was not possible in Mississippi because she was considered Black and folks knew her and her family. But in Chicago, she could drive across town to the white part of town or travel across town, and she got a job, and she passed as white. And so Harris talks about this in a really moving way, because in choosing to pass as white, her grandmother exposed herself to the kind of sort of everyday, taken for granted racism that happened in the white community. And Harris, says decades later, when her grandmother talked about this experience of denying her identity to gain access to resources, that you could still hear the bitterness in her voice. And so that really spoke to me, having been in a lot of situations in which folks assumed I was white if I was by myself, or I'm introduced to someone, and the first thing people say is not like, Victor's mixed race, and don't say sort of subtly racist things or even openly racist things, because he'll be offended. So, I've had things like, one of the examples I use in the book was someone telling me the student of color center at Vassar should be paved over and replaced with whites only parking, thinking that I would find this funny, right? So it's often done as a joke, or, being told that, a group of Black folks driving a nice car must be drug dealers. These were things that happened to me frequently enough that they made an impact, right? Sure. I won't say it was an everyday occurrence, but fairly frequently. So that was my introduction. And then, I went to grad school to study with Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who writes about colorblind racism. And then, in my own career, I have written about race and racism, racial progress, and the way that sort of organizations use race, both openly and in sort of openly discriminatory ways or in more subtle ways.
I promise you I want to get back to specifics. There's so much good stuff that you're writing about, and I'm learning. And I thought I've read like a lot of books on this, but I eat this stuff up. I think it's so important for everybody. And I love the way that you write. But based on what you just said and kind of what we've been talking about, who you are in your career in this book, how do you kind of characterize or frame recent events? Having studied these issues and written about these issues and taught these issues for years before the summer of 2020, before Donald Trump, before most of these videos that are now were horrified by that have gone viral, before Christopher Rufo, I think, and whoever else hijacked critical race theory and terrified people and white people in every town in America, including mine, which I told you about before we hit record at Board of Education meetings. Before all that, like, how do you frame the events in terms of George Floyd's, murder, to Black Lives Matter's popularity, summer 2020, to the what a lot of people refer to as white lash? Where do you start and not end? Because we're still in the beginning, I suppose, of this white lash. How do you frame it? What happened?
So I think this is a really interesting question, and this is also, something I write about in the book, but also I write about in my scholarship. And I think when I talk about this in my classes, I'm like, look, the sort of mainstream story of race in the United States is slavery is bad. We fixed that. Dr. King, we had Jim Crow for a while. Dr. King came along and we fixed that. Rosa Parks sat, and then, Obama was elected and racism was over. And I think critical race theorists offer a very different conception of racial progress or how these things play out. And I would say not just critical race theorists, I would say sort of the empirical evidence in the social sciences on racial inequality is, in my interpretation, and there are many folks who would agree with me, but like really in line with the claims of critical race theory. And that is, yes, racism is resilient, and that kinds of inequality that we see have actually been with us since the very start of the Republic. So have things improved, or has progress happened? Yes, some progress has happened, but I will use a Kendi quote here that I really like, who Kendi is not a critical race theorist, but he says, racial progress has occurred, also racist progress has occurred. And so the way to think about this is, if we think about immediately after slavery, there was a period in which there was sort of profound change, profound forward movement. Black folks, black men, at least, were enfranchised. There was opening of schools in the South. There's a number of black folks elected to state legislatures. And then you had a backlash that led to Jim Crow and the rise of lynching, terrorism, a system of racial etiquette in which black folks had to demean themselves in every area of social life for almost 100 years. And so then we had the civil rights movement, another period of sort of profound progressive change, and we entered a period of backlash. We could disagree. We could argue over whether the period of backlash that we are in right now is a culmination of things that started immediately following the civil rights movement. Or whether, there was something new. I tend to think that the Rufos of the world and what was happening with Donald Trump was a response to Obama's election. And the current critical race theory moral panic, I think, is a response to, actually, Rufo has said this himself, that he was responding to the protests around George Floyd's murder, that those worried him. He started reading some of the books about race in the U.S. He noticed folks citing critical race theorists, and he decided that critical race theory was, I think he uses the language of the perfect weapon, but I don't want to quote him directly on that, but it's clear he has used it as a weapon.
Yeah, very well said. You went way back, and I think that's important. But specifically, I don't know. I mean, maybe you haven't paid as much attention to the specific. I mean, I don't know who would have, outside of folks like you, but like I have paid a lot of attention to just the kind of media end of it. And it does seem like this one guy, Rufo, came up with this idea, as you just said, seen it written about in books, and it just took off. And I'm not sure where in history. I guess in recent history, I think it's my friend Wajahat Ali that tells me the thing that's most similar. I like moral panic, your words there, is the post 9/11 anti-Muslim stuff like Sharia. They're going to bring all of their customs and traditions and everything. We're all going to be yeah. And that seems similar. So I don't know how much we should even need to belabor it, but it does. To me, it matters a lot. I think that guy deserves most of the credit because after he does it, he becomes famous, the most sought after guest in right-wing media. But, Hannity and Tucker and then Donald Trump start using the phrase critical race theory, which before then we really were having such thoughtful discussions about it. And your book goes into all that. So I want to spend, the rest of the time talking about that. But just if there's anything else left to say about the kind of the movement.
So I do think what you're saying about Christopher Rufo's involvement is really important. And I think that it got picked up sort of pretty directly by Donald Trump after Christopher Rufo went on Tucker one night and talked about critical race theory being a threat to the nation.
Yeah.
And Trump picked it up pretty quickly after that.
Just to be clear, I'm almost positive this is why he was so damaging. He picked it up the next day, meaning any crank, any conspiracist could go on TV, and there's no threshold at most cable news, certainly not Fox, say whatever they wanted, and the most powerful man in the world would then take that comment and tweet it and talk about it. So just to be clear, I think it was overnight, and that just blew everything up.
So yes, I think it was overnight. It might have been 2 days at maximum before they got it together. The executive order came out shortly after that, in which Trump, said he was banning critical race theory in the federal government. But I also want to back up here and say that, yes, someone crazy going on Fox and then the president tweeting it out for this is striking, because this is something I study. But I also think it's important to remember that he did that for 4 years. Right? He watched Fox for 4 years, and I would wake up and be like, wait a minute, Trump is threatening North Korea with nuclear annihilation? What is going on, right? It was a period in which, and I forget, I think it was Media Matters. There were these folks watching Fox and Friends, and then correlating what they were talking about on Fox and Friends with Trump's tweets. So yes, this was super important for critical race theory, but I also think it speaks to the sort of general unseriousness of that presidency.
Yes,
and that president.
Yes, very well underscored. The only thing I would add is it was worse than him seeing somebody on Fox and taking what they said and sharing it. He would fucking hire them. He would hire them. I mean, if you said what he wanted to believe about hurricanes and their directions, you could go on and be like, that wasn't a hurricane. He'd be like, I agree. Hire him. He runs
No, you're absolutely right. Remember when they changed the map of the hurricane?
Yes.
They changed.
Yes, that's what I was referencing. He got yes. Yeah. Crazy. I mean, Peter Navarro and several others, some of his lawyers, he just saw them on TV, and the next thing you knew, they were in the White House. I mean, Bannon, who I worked with, I should have told you that before I hit record. I shared a studio with Steve Bannon every day, Victor. And then one day he wasn't there at SiriusXM, where we worked together with his horrible anti-Semitic racist show. And he was working. He was running the Trump campaign. I just went into work one day and they're like, hey, where's Bannon? Oh, he's running Trump's campaign. He was doing my job yesterday. Anyway, your book, let me just ask you kind of a general question. You write about this at different points, but because there's so much to be said about critical race theory, and it's such an important idea to try to understand, and intersectionality and everything that you write about and teach. How would you explain the idea to someone who's terrified of it? These people I'm fighting at the board, they're going to start teaching this, and then basically their understanding is it makes white people lesser than, to some extent, they'll say. And obviously they talk about their feelings are going to be hurt. I was proud when I stood up on the board and said, in front of them, I said, if your white child comes home and says something they learned in school made them feel bad about being white, you're not parenting correctly. It's not the teacher. It's not the lesson. It's you. Your kid can't. Anyway, so what would you say to these people?
So I think there's a couple ways to answer this.
Sure.
One, in the book, I'm like, look, I think social science backs me on this, and that is there's a certain group of folks who I am never going to convince.
Sure.
And I think, if you've spent any time on Twitter, there are certain arguments that are not worth engaging or
I disagree. I disagree. I will argue as long as I'm awake and have an internet connection, but I take your point.
Okay. Well, I will not, because I have a limited amount of time to get things done. So, but the other thing that I would say is, like, look, critical race theory arose to explain a racial backlash. It rose to explain why the law, which had been really effective in around the civil rights movement, right, and the strategies that civil rights lawyers used, the law had become an effective tool for, like, making America more democratic, making America more inclusive. Some scholars say that post-1965 and the Voting Rights Act is the first time that we had a true multiracial democracy in the United States, because that's the first time we had full enfranchisement. And there were folks who were always opposed to that and trying to stop it. So I don't know that would necessarily, alleviate the worries of folks who are, like, carrying guns to school board meetings to stop critical race theory. But I think it is a serious body of scholarship that has been around for about 40 years. I don't think it's lurking in kids' school books. And I would say the idea that it will make people feel bad, or, it's targeting white folks. So there were white folks who were some of the founders early on of critical race theory. White scholars were involved and have been involved from the start. But I think, there are certain aspects of American history that, like, maybe we should feel bad about. Like, if you're a normal person, like, slavery was a horrendous human rights violation that we are still suffering some of the effects of. And I don't think it's abnormal to say, like, yeah, that was bad. And if I think about that too long, I'll feel a little bad about it. I think education in and of itself can force growth and can force us to think about things that are hard to grapple with. I am an educator, so I think that is good. But, there are folks that are uncomfortable with that. And again, some of them I think I'll convince. Some of them I don't think I'll convince. And I think in those cases, what you need is social movements, right? Because social movements can it's not about convincing them, it's about getting the kind of political power you need so folks can be less oppressed. Right. That's what the civil rights movement did. Yeah. And have more opportunity, less oppressed, more opportunity. Yeah. Also, you use this phrase I never really heard. I'm sure others have used it, but in another conversation you had about your book of when kids learn things that are hard that make them feel bad, you used the phrase moral growth, which I thought was really, I'm going to steal that for sure, because that's what school is. When you read a powerful book, classic American literature, or I suppose foreign as well, so I don't remember using that phrase, but it's a good one. I do think that I believe you. I believe I used it. But I think, yeah, like there's evidence that kids learning about the history of race and racism, even in a critical way, that it makes them more empathetic, that it helps them see across difference. To me, I don't understand why you wouldn't want that, right? And I also think, kids, sometimes when I hear people talk about this, I'm like, you're not worried that your kids won't understand it. You're worried that they will. Kids are very perceptive, and they understand. I mean, they're obsessed with fairness in some ways, right? Especially little kids. Yes. And when they see something is unfair, and they see that you might be benefiting from that unfairness, they're probably going to let you know. And, having a kid who sometimes judges me for my decisions, like, it's not always comfortable, but sometimes he's right. And I think that's what parents are afraid of.
Very well said. Yeah.
At least some.
Yeah, no, for sure. Very well said. I couldn't agree more. Okay, what is, let's see, what was the, I'm just lost my notes on the book, but the wages of whiteness, I think, is a really interesting chapter and important idea to kind of explain to people. People get so triggered by that word whiteness. White people do. How do you see it, and why is it so important? Why do you include your research and thoughts on it?
So this is a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois in his famous book about Black Reconstruction. And what Du Bois is talking about there is the idea that following abolition and during Jim Crow, not all white folks in the South were rich. In fact, many of them were impoverished, right? But racism, structural racism, and the rituals of Jim Crow, Black folks having to swear on different Bibles when they were in court, if they could even be in court, having to walk on a different set of stairs if they were walking to get on the train because, white folks' shoes, we don't want them defiled by walking in the same spots that Black folks had walked. All of these rituals reminded poor white Americans that there was a kind of sort of level below which they could not fall. Right. And what Du Bois says is, look, this wasn't necessarily paid in terms of higher wages in the workplace, but it was paid in terms of access to schools, access to better schools, access to public accommodations in ways that weren't demeaning, access to parks, all of these little psychological perks that allowed folks to buy into the system, even though the benefits materially that they got may have not been very great.
Right. I love how you weave history and quotes and scholars in with your own personal narratives as well. I think that makes, the book so interesting because you yourself, as you've already established, have had such an interesting and unique life. I mean, a lot just because of your appearance. It's fascinating. It's such an important thing and in many ways a sad thing, obviously, that, even within, Black folks, the lightness of your skin, the darkness of your skin, hair, all of this stuff kind of matters and there's consequence to it. But in your case, being in rooms where people didn't realize there was someone with a lot of Black blood and family in his life and just taking that for granted. I love that. It's so important, really, really important. Give me one more if you want, one more of those narratives if you want before we have to wrap up from the book or your life.
Another discussion of those kinds of interactions. I mean, one I think about a lot is just the difference between, my brother is, he's darker than me. Folks often ask him, what are you, right? Like they often wonder, which doesn't happen with me that much. But I remember we're only a year and a half apart in age. And in our early teens, there were a lot of times we would do stuff like, go to the mall together or go to stores. And they would follow him around the stores. He would be harassed. He got treated very differently in school than I did. And he's brilliant, but he was just treated very, very differently. And so I think, sociologists do these studies that are called audit studies, in which they send two equally matched people of different races out to do things like try and get an apartment or try and get a job. Right. And these studies always find sort of, high levels of racial discrimination, even among people who say they wouldn't discriminate. And, my case is a little different because I'm mixed race, but I often think about those studies sort of in relation to my daily life with my family. And, then, there's more recent stuff of just now, if I'm out with my dad, people ask how we know each other or things like,
he kidnapped me when I was very young with my uncle.
Yeah, right. Actually, read the first chapter. Another example is he was transferring a car to me, AAA, of, my grandfather had passed, and we went to transfer this car. Now, we have the same last name, and the title was on file at AAA. And we get there, and the woman said she wasn't going to do it. She wasn't going to transfer the car. And so in any single case, you don't actually know what's happening. And this is one of the things that's hard about this kind of discrimination, right? But my dad was like, well, this car is in my name. We put the title on file specifically because I knew I was going to transfer it to my son. And she couldn't sort of get over the idea that I was his son, and she didn't think it was a legal transfer. And again, in any given case, you don't know if it's discrimination, but I this is a thing that happens too. I get really angry about these instances. And a lot of times my dad tells me, calm down. And I think that is often a reflection of our different experiences too, because I don't think that I'm going to get arrested. Or I'm going to get harassed by the police, or things are going to escalate in a way. But for him, these often feel, well, I'm interpreting, right? He hasn't told me this, but I'm interpreting. But I have the sense that these feel more threatening to him than they do to me.
Listen, man, the book is so great, so important, a really important contribution to a lot of the other literature that's been written. I'm sure being in your classroom is a real privilege for your students, and certainly has been for me and folks listening to our conversation. Dr. Victor Ray, thank you very much. I hope that you'll join me again anytime you want to continue.
Let me know.
All right, thanks, man.
All right, thank you so much.
All right, there you go. Victor Ray on Twitter at Victor Eric Ray. Go get the book right now. It's so good. Very interesting. Add it to your library. Learn from it on critical race theory, why it matters and why you should care. And I'm looking forward to talking with him again. Good stuff. Go tweet at him right now. Okay, also, another great guest for the first time on the show today. She came highly recommended from our friend Mara Quint, who was on the show yesterday. She's a progressive strategist, a senior political and community organizer at the intersection of online and offline organizing. She splits her work between organizing to elect Democratic candidates and winning progressive policy. She's a leader in the work to make college free and end student loans. She's proud to have contributed to winning New Hampshire twice in 2016, first as Bernie Sanders' digital director, and then as MoveOn.org state director, which Hillary and Senator Hassan won by less than 1,000 votes. Melissa Byrne ran for DNC vice chair in 2016, and she has worked really hard to build a strong progressive Democratic Party. That is her bio from her Twitter over at MC Byrne. Follow her at MC Byrne. Hashtag cancel student debt. She's behind that and so much more. I really enjoyed and learned a lot from our conversation. For the first time, Melissa Byrne right now. There she is, Melissa Byrne, somewhere in the world. I didn't ask. It's none of my business. We don't need to know, because some people maybe they don't like you now because you were one of the Americans who planted the seed about a major issue that has just been, I don't know how you want to describe it, partially solved. A major triumph on student loan debt forgiveness, an issue that you were one of the first people in the country to start talking about. Welcome to Stand Up, and tell me about that seed and how you came to it.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So how I'm thinking about it is that I showed up to a party really early. Like when you're not supposed to show up, you show up and like you're standing around awkwardly, you're by yourself. Maybe the host is still in the kitchen prepping stuff and is maybe a little cranky that you actually showed up on time because you're really supposed to show up an hour after you're supposed to show up.
Yeah.
But eventually everyone does show up and then the party is an absolute success. So that's how I'm kind of feeling right now. But back in 2010, when I was pushed to like see this issue in a different light, an issue where I had a lot of student loan debt and where I had a lot of shame and had a lot of like hatred of myself for having all of this debt. Now it's like, wait, everyone showed up and now everyone is on board. And it's very validating and excited to see what happens.
Yeah, great way of putting it. A great way of putting it. So take us back to 2010 and kind of how what your college experience and trying to pay for it was like and where you're at in your life. And then we'll talk about, how a lot of the system is rigged and then get to some of the arguments. So where were you in 2010?
So in 2010, I was working on a project to stop the Republicans from forcing cuts to Social Security and benefits. And so there was this thing called the Fiscal Commission. They wanted to do a grand bargain, which basically meant raising the retirement age, which is a benefit cut for working people. They wanted to do all these other shenanigans. They wanted to get money to Wall Street, all of this kind of stuff. So I was working on this project. Meanwhile, I was also fighting with my various servicers for my student loans. I had a mix of public and private. I would cry on the phone and ask, like, can I just have one person to talk to? Like, look, we're in a long-term relationship. I should just be able to call you up and be like, I'm having an issue this month. I'm going to be like a few weeks late, but like we're together for a long time. Like it just shouldn't be whatever random person picks up on the phone from a call center wherever. But LOL. And things started getting bad because I would call them and they would say, the prompt screen would be like, push 4 if you're from a congressional office. And I'm like, oh, things are getting really bad if they just have a button for Congress people when they're calling on behalf of their constituents. So that was a sign something was wrong. But also people don't talk about especially back in 2010, that was pre-Occupy. That was just pre a lot of things that are happening and still in the shadow of the economic crisis from 2008.
Yeah.
But my boss invited me to go to an early morning meeting at 8 a.m. at the AFL-CIO in D.C. And I was with him, and I was the youngest one around the table because this was, 12 years ago, and I was still young, as opposed to now where I like to wear like big hats and like walk through gardens and all the things when you're no longer young. And there was the main speaker for this like early morning meeting asked people to raise their hand if they had student loan debt. I kind of went like this. I was the only one that raised my hand because I was the youngest. And he goes, well, how much debt do you have? And I was like, because I'm sitting next to my boss, all these other executive directors, people in DC can be a little judgy on things.
Well, hold on a second. Someone asked you how much debt you have, and you're in front of people you work with, and you're supposed to say, I have this many dollars in debt. So it's a super weird question. Totally inappropriate, but get, to the point. Therein lies the shame, especially if you're in front of colleagues. But okay, you take us back. Sorry.
Yeah. So I just said, I'm not telling. I was just like, look, I'm not telling. And he goes, well, as long as you're ashamed of your debt, the banks have all the power. And that was the first time in my life I had someone tell me that it wasn't my fault. I had student loan debt. Like in college, my peers would be like, ew, you have student loan debt, or ew, you're going into a lot of debt, or ew, that's going to be really hard to pay off, or like, do you understand how interest formulas work? But here's someone telling me that the problem wasn't me. It wasn't me failing. It wasn't my family failing. It was a structural problem. And then he asked me again how much debt I have. And I said half the amount because like, for real, like talking about that in public is really hard. And so the person who embarrassed me in front of my boss and all these people and then moved me to action, you might have heard of him, the Reverend Jesse Jackson. So he's a really good organizer.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Yeah, I met him years ago and very interesting. I don't know why I had to drop that I met him to try to impress you, but it's to the issue. Wow. The issue, I guess, in this case, and I never thought we'd be talking about this, would be the shame part of it and why that matters. Just say another word or two about the shame that you felt then and that, basically now so many people don't necessarily have that shame because they realize a lot of people have been, however you want to put it, screwed, taken advantage of, not had the opportunities they thought they would have, overpromised. So what is the shame about?
I mean, the shame is that if you do everything is about from the time you get in preschool, like you're going to go to college, which is great. We need education. Like I'm not one of those people who are like, oh, let's get people not to go to college, because that's also a scam. That's about poor kids being tracked into doing work that might not be right for them. Like I believe that everyone, when you finish K to 12, should get the education that matches what you want to do in your life, and that all work is valuable unless you're like some like ridiculous right-wing Republican doing bad things. Like your work isn't valuable to society. So aside from that little caveat, work is valuable and people should get the training they need to do the work that's best for them and what's going to make them happy and productive members of society.
How do you feel about the guy, that Coca-Cola company, who comes up with a new formula to get more sugar into us?
Yeah, probably not the greatest use of one's life, but
But maybe he's not as bad as, I don't know. We could keep going.
He's not as bad as like Stephen Miller.
Well, who is really?
True.
It's hard. There should be some kind of Godwin's law against referencing Stephen Miller so early in the who's the worst conversation.
Yeah, I haven't even had coffee yet. So
okay, so the shame point is a really important point that you don't think about. So you go from there in 2010, where you're working to advocate for Social Security, which is a pretty interesting thing for a very young person to be working on, because it's an issue, obviously disability, but more importantly, mostly benefits retired people. So I guess that says who you are or something.
So it was helpful because I left that meeting being like, okay, I'm going to make college free and I'm going to cancel student loan debt. I'll get some funding and we'll just do this like really quickly. Because I was like just having one of those like inspired moments. And then Social Security is interesting because as you work, you're paying into a pot of money.
Right.
And that pot of money is being used to help the current retirees, current survivors. So a lot of children get Social Security benefits. Like if their parents died, it's also an insurance program for orphans and then for disability. And I was like, wait, what if we pay for college but you get the benefit? We do reverse. You get the benefit first and then everyone pays in like a super tiny payroll tax. And I'm like, this is brilliant. And then I did some research and found out that's how Australia funds college, through their HECS program, Higher Education Contribution Scheme. So I was like, okay, maybe I'm not as brilliant as I think I am, but I'm on the right track. But so I left that being able to, I was working with a lot of economists, good economists, not the ones that were having meltdowns over the last week. That has been delicious to watch. But it got me thinking about it. And then I quickly learned that when you want to do something like get rid of student loan debt and make college free, that's not something like big funders think is possible. And so what I realized is that I needed to do my work around moving people to get people hyped about cancellation, hyped about free college would be something that I would do in addition to the work I could do that would like pay the bills, because I still had to eat, because you can't eat lifetime earnings expectations.
Yeah. Very interesting. Get back to the issue, or let's stay in 2010 and take me on the trajectory of the issue. What do you do next? I mean, it seems like you arrived at the phrase "cancel student debt" in our conversation quickly. Meaning, was that a phrase that had been being used? Was that a rallying cry? Where did you come to this idea of canceling the debt or any other solution? And when did other smart, passionate people get on board?
Yeah. So, I was thinking, I didn't use the word cancellation because I was still thinking about like, well, what if we forgive the debt? What if we got rid of the debt?
Right.
There were conversations that were starting to happen about what if we reduce the interest rates? What if you change how you pay? Like, I think that was around the time the Obama administration pushed for changing like the income defined repayment program. So it was all of these tweaks around the edges. But I wanted to have a conversation about no more tweaks around the edges. Let's just get right to the core of the problem. And so this is August of 2010. So basically 12 years ago, exactly.
Yeah. And
then I would slowly talk with people about it and try to get advice. 2011 happened. I switched over to work for a labor union. I was talking to people there to figure out, like, do I try to get funding? What do I do? Then Occupy happens. And Occupy is when all of a sudden I think there was maybe a 2-month heyday of Occupy from mid-September through early November, when everyone was talking about income inequality, all of these issues. So you had a cohort. I was part of the Occupy in DC. So there were Occupies all over the country.
Yeah.
It wasn't just Occupy Wall Street in Zuccotti Park in New York. So I was part of the one in DC, and I did signs on student debt. And then it was cute. I'm like, oh my God, people are doing it in New York too. And that was exciting.
You made signs. You said signs for canceling student debt, and you saw that spreading.
Yes. And I don't remember I can't tell you like what language I used back then. There was a lot going on. A while ago. I wasn't thinking like, oh, I need to like document everything I do for some like documentary in 12 years.
Oh, that'd have been good.
Yeah, I don't think like that. I was just like, we got to solve this problem. Everything is a mess. And then around the same time, MoveOn.org opened up a petition platform where people could start their own petitions. And so along the same time, like Natalia Abrams and her cohort of people, they started a petition called Forgive My Student Loan Debt, which was the first petition that MoveOn got on their platform to reach 1 million people. And that was, I believe, maybe that was late 2011 into 2012. And so that gets you to that point. And it starts to show like, oh, this issue, there's traction behind this issue. And then you have people in New York City doing work with the Debt Collective. And then you also, around the time, you saw lawyers starting to get calls from potential clients about this being a consumer rights issue. And over in government, you might have heard of her, Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah.
She was able to get the Dodd-Frank Act passed, which set up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And then Rohit Chopra, who now currently is the administrator for the CFPB, he was running the student loan section. And so he was pushing there, and then he went over to the Department of Education. So we basically had all of these different entities like working in their areas to like start pushing this as an issue. And I wrote up a plan for an organization and tried to get it funded, but I'm not good at asking for money. And what I found is that people who've grown up like working class or poor are at a disadvantage when it comes to asking rich people for money, because people who grow up rich are taught from the moment they're born how to ask for money. It's like very convoluted how all of this world works. So I kept doing like organizing for organizations and doing client work and working. And the cool part about that was this whole time I was doing work for the women's rights community, for other organizations. So I was building up really good relationships across the whole movement, which is really helpful because solidarity is really how you build wins. And then you might have heard of this guy from Vermont in 2015. Mm-hmm. He decided to run for president.
Howard Dean?
Yeah, actually his like frenemy. They hate each other.
Do they hate each other?
They hate each other. It's kind of funny.
Oh, I wonder, is there any reason that we know exactly why, or just they're just completely different people and styles, but
they're just different people.
All right. Anyway.
But anyways.
So you start Bernie Sanders, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. So I was working on a city council race in Philadelphia for the wonderful Helen Gim, who hopefully maybe one day she runs for president. So on the election day for that primary race, it's like the hour before polls close and everyone's out, and it's just the waiting for the polls to close and about to do the final checks. I get this email in my inbox, and I knew everyone who was writing the emails for the Bernie campaign. Like, there is no magic. I know how the sausage is made. And yeah, I get this email, and I believe the subject line was like, "Tell me your student debt story." And the email was, "Reply with your student debt story." And everything clicked in my head. It was like this huge light bulb going off that we cancel student loan debt and make college free by Bernie doing well. Because the amount of media coverage, as someone, you work in media, so you understand like how influential media can be in media coverage, that the amount of media that Bernie's campaign would generate on this issue would be more than any organization could ever get funded to do. And it didn't matter what my job was on the Bernie campaign, but being a part of that and being able to push the issue is how we basically take 10 years off of a trajectory of like moving this issue as a key issue.
Let me ask you, it's a fascinating story and timeline on any issue to be able to follow that. You have been right in the middle of it. And I think you got to stick with, I'm not good at metaphors, but like the seed growing into the plant. Or is that even an analogy? Anyway, the point is, Alyssa, that a more abstract question I wanted to ask you, which I think is kind of not being talked about enough, is this issue, this specific issue. Folks generally understand debt. They understand loans. They understand things about college. People generally understand that college costs a lot now more than, and some people understand that college costs a lot more now than it did when they were younger. And I'm talking about the olds me and above, but especially above. My question really is, this issue, part of the problem around messaging is, like any issue, if you don't know what it is, you didn't experience it, you have your opinions and that can then be informed by, misinformation or bad people. And in this case, it seems like this is an issue for a very specific generation, or would you call it two, of Americans who got caught in this scam situation, for lack of a better, 1 hour conversation. Well, we'll get to hopefully the situation. So who's getting affected by it in terms of age and even socioeconomics? And do you think it's true that there's a lot of people that just don't get it because they didn't have this issue when they went to college, when they were growing up in their America?
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones where people, especially thinking back like 10 years ago, 12 years ago, as this was starting to bubble. So I joke around that I was patient zero for this. I started college in 97, which was a few years after the student loans were deregulated and they started, making the private sector was making a lot of money off of the FFEL loans, which are the ones that were generated through private banks, but federally guaranteed. So people might know the buzzwords, Sallie Mae, Navient, that's that world. And then, so people who were just starting out college then that's when things started to really go sky high. And that's also when they made it so you could garnish Social Security benefits for defaulted student loan debt. So you're starting to see an uptick then, starting in like 97 and into the early 2000s, of garnishments going up for your Social Security beneficiaries. And then there's also, so the student loans, it's not just people that are 18 and take out student loan debt. It's also parents and grandparents through the Parent Plus program. And so what we're starting to see is that parents who didn't have money to save for their kids' college were starting to take out a whole bunch of loans to be able to pay for their kids' college. And then also graduate school. So if you see the 2008 recession, a lot of people were told, oh, if you can't get a job, just go to graduate school, as a way to wait that out and to upskill. You need more skills. And the other part of this that we're not talking about, we don't have time to really get into now, is that all of this stems from, you might have heard this guy, Ronald Reagan. Him and his advisors back in the 70s, when he was governor of California, didn't like the kinds of people that were going to college. And so they got rid of free college in California. And that really helped push the idea of defunding higher education. And there was no moral panic around defunding higher education. And it was more of like, banks were like, oh, we can make money off this. Services like, we can make money off this. So everyone saw this cohort of people whose parents couldn't write a check for their college education as potential revenue sources. And so that's how all of this kind of erupted into where we are today.
One of the issues I'd love to know more about the history here. I'm going to read up on it, and maybe you can provide me some sources, some books, some articles, and including yourself. Sounds like you can speak about all of it, but I kind of want to know the root causes of this issue and what it changed for Americans of a certain class to not be able to afford education. You mentioned Australia, but there's so many other countries that have it figured out a lot better than we do. But one of the issues people like to point to is, at some point, government started subsidizing college and loans, and so then institutions themselves, including public schools, started charging more, because as long as the government's going to be paid for it, well, we're going to raise our tuitions. Now, I don't even know if I got that even remotely right. Did that happen? And is that an issue?
Well, that's what the economists will say. But what really happened is that the share of the budgets that the universities got from the government went down. So it's literally like the government quit funding higher education and slashed their budgets. And they still had a budget gap. And so that's where loans came in. And then that just kind of creates this like terrible cycle.
But did colleges start raising their rates because they, for the reasons I just stated?
No, they raised their rates to make up revenue gaps. And then you also had, if you look at, there's that U.S. News and World Report rankings that come out. Yeah. If you'll notice that colleges within a certain grouping, like elite colleges, will all be, for some reason, it costs the same amount of money to educate someone at rural Cornell in Ithaca, New York, as it does in like Columbia in New York City. So like a lot of times the prices would be amongst like cohorts of the private schools.
Two Ivy League schools, two of the best schools in the country, but clearly one has a much higher standard of living. Everything costs more in New York City than it does in Ithaca, New York, two places I've lived in. Well, I didn't lived in Ithaca, but I grew up outside Syracuse. So, I mean, like that's the point.
We're outside Syracuse.
Marcellus High School, graduate of 1993.
Very cool. I used to go to the Camillus Mall.
Oh, why? Why were you ever there?
My family's from Seneca Falls originally, so I go to Cuba Lake every summer, and my uncle lives in Syracuse. So
there is that is the birthplace of the suffrage movement, and there's a wonderful museum that on the way back from a gig I stopped and went to alone, even though I had two daughters, which would have benefited from it. And then I tried to get them to go, and they're like, "We're good." Like, what do you? Anyway, that's fascinating. Okay, so is the difference between public universities or state schools and private schools in terms of how students afford their tuition? Is that a good question to get to this in a moment here, policy that was passed?
Yeah, so I think like one thing is that there's not enough seats for in public schools. So private schools exist for a reason. Well, I mean, that goes way back to like the 1600s, but that's an even longer conversation. But there are, for example, if we just told everybody to go to a public college, there's not enough seats for everybody. So private schools exist. They are huge economic generators for communities. They're the head lobbyists for the private colleges, make $700,000 a year. So they are a formidable force, and they serve an important function. I went to private schools. I got a great education from them. And if you look at the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, did a report that shows federal subsidies at a lot of the private schools are about 60 to 70 grand per student. So really private schools are more of a public-private partnership. And then public schools are great. It just depends on which state you're in. So if a state is committed to higher education, there's a lot more subsidies. They're cheaper and they work well to get everyone in the door, get them educated, and get people on their career path you want. But, a child in, like, say, Nebraska might have a different outcome than a child in California. And I personally don't think you should have different outcomes based on, like, where you're born. If you're in the U.S., you should have the same opportunities.
If the caveat being, if you're in the U.S., there's just so much money in this country, you could have what you're talking about in terms of college, much less healthcare or employment opportunities. So, okay. Now I just want to take on a couple of the arguments, and hopefully, if you still have time,
I'm excited. Let's bring it.
Yeah, well, I want to give you the choice here on the game show of arguments to pick the one that. The way I like to communicate in media is I'd like to try to give listeners, the arguments when possible. That's sometimes hard to do, but to understand where the most impactful points can be made. In this case, what do you think is the argument that really does resonate with most people over kind of the moral idea of forgiving student loan debt and take that argument on? So what do you think is maybe the most odious, not most odious, but the most kind of convincing argument that's being made that probably drives you crazy? I'm giving you the choice on this first one.
Why don't you bring up the ones about how it's only rich kids who have student loan debt?
People are saying it's only rich kids?
Yeah, that if you cancel student loan debt, it's a gift to rich kids.
Oh, got it. Yes. Okay. So, yeah, how does that break down in terms of who? Because it's clear that some kids that don't need it are going to be having their debt forgiven, I guess, but the vast majority of people are not. Help me understand.
So what some of these folks say, I joke around, I call them the bad group chat. I imagine my enemies are all in a group chat, and they're doing a group chat about how they're going to like go after these like terrible student debtors that are like demanding justice. So when you imagine them as like having a group chat, and then I actually feel sad for them. I'm like, that's their life. Like, that's their group chat. Like, I'm like, thank God. I'd rather have this debt than be them. I love that. So what they'll argue is that, well, if you have student loan debt, you're going to have these amazing lifetime earnings. So you are the most affluent in society. You don't need your debt canceled. It's only people that are affluent that go to college. They're the only ones that have the debt. Whereas what we know is that of student loan borrowers, about 60 to 70% were on Pell Grants, when they were in college, which means they're like the poorest of the poor. And there's a whole bunch of people that their parental income, like, so a lot of times if you think about it, like, you know, a child, it's 18 years. You're 18 years old when you go to college, which means a family income, you might be struggling that first maybe 10 years of raising a child, but then you might hit your stride in your career when your kid is like 16, 17. So when they go and fill out the FAFSA form when they're 18, you might all of a sudden have a bump in income that bumps you just above qualifying for Pell, but you didn't have 15 years to save for college because during those 15 years you were worried about like, oh my gosh, they need new pants every month. They're just growing, or they need new shoes, you know, that it's just because life is complicated for families. And a lot of times like strict forms don't account for life being complicated. And I personally think that a parent shouldn't have to be worried about their kids' college education. They should be home to hug them, to go to their soccer game, to, you know, just sit on the couch with them and like watch really bad TV. Cause that's like how you build these relationships that are going to get you through like the really hard moments.
Yeah, you're making a really good point, which I think would be, you know, someone who has daughters who are 14 and 17, this idea of I just got to work a little bit more, a little harder, a few more hours, take a side hustle so that I can, you know, afford the kids' college. That's going to be very expensive, or much less my retirement. The point being, our generation and most Americans, you know, we have a feeling that we have to just I certainly do, keep working, make is, you know, because you're just never going to be able to afford a college in this case is what we're talking about, much less other things. So let me ask you another one, which is, I think this one resonates a lot. I'm seeing this a lot, including on my Facebook page, this idea that, hey, I'm all for this loan forgiveness, all for it. I don't fully understand it, but I think morally it's the right thing to do. My concern is that they didn't fix the problem. So another generation of Americans is going to have the same problem. So they just gave up. You know, they just gave all these, or just disappeared the loans, but now they didn't fix the issue. My understanding is that's not quite the case here, Melissa. What do we need to know that?
Yeah. So one, the president doesn't have the ability, or the Secretary of Education doesn't have the ability on their own to like wave a magic wand and like fix how we fund college going forward. But they did have the ability legally to take care of the people that are currently in harm's way. And a lot of times, if you think about triaging, you want to stop the bleeding. So we stop the bleeding first. So this is a cohort of 43 million people who get immediate help. And now, because we can actually have a conversation about fixing college, because 10 years ago, no one was really taking seriously the idea of like, let's get free college. Let's fix this. Like, it would be in passing. No one was funding real efforts for it. Again, it was all like tweaks around the edges. Whereas this morning in Politico, they released their morning consult poll that shows 77% of Americans, of people that were polled, want to lower the cost of college. So this cancellation conversation, because I mean, CNN was like having this on every 15-minute block, had a story on cancellation, whether it was our opponents or them saying a little bit of nice things or all of this. But the media coverage of college now has been wall to wall. And now people are saying, yeah, we need to fix this. So we can actually, this generates the spectacle that you need to then be able to move Congress. So hopefully, as long as November goes well, in January, we can start fixing this.
What have you seen about other polling since this policy was announced a few days ago in terms of, and I mean, hard to know how accurate it is, but if how the questions are asked and so on in the polling. But what else have you heard? I know it's just kind of happened, but it is getting a tremendous amount of attention, peak attention probably, unless something else happens. What else are you seeing in terms of the public's perception of this policy?
Well, the presidential approval rating is going up, so that's starting to tick up. So I'm like, I'll claim that as a win. And then today it showed that it was popular. More people support it than are opposed to it.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is when you look at numbers about, do you support what the president did on canceling student loan debt? I think part of the reason why it's actually artificially lower, because a lot of people wanted him to go bigger. And so the question doesn't differentiate, like, are you glad he took action versus should he have taken more action? So I would like to see a poll where it's like, Do you support this? Should he have gone more? Are you opposed to this? So then you can kind of combine the like supported this action and wants him to do more. Because I think that would tell a fuller story of support. And I keep talking about there were people who were left behind on this. And so my job as an organizer is to make sure we don't leave people behind. So we just start working on round 2.
Good for you. That's awesome. You're an awesome human being for what you've dedicated pretty much your life to and all of these different causes and organizations you've been involved with. But getting back to my question about it doesn't fix the problem, I thought there were some remedies in this solution announced in terms of interest rates and what and how the loans are subsidized moving forward or structured.
Yeah, so there is. So part of this is opening up a regulatory process, which is really boring Washington speak for a whole different side project through the Department of Education to redo the income defined repayment program. And so taking it from 10% of your discretionary income a month for 20 years, bringing it down to 5% of your discretionary income. And the biggest change is that while you're in repayment on an IDR plan, you will not accumulate interest, because part of the problem is that student loan interest is continuously compounding.
Yeah.
It's not a set amount. It's just all the time. And so if you were on an IDR plan, which the point of IDR was to reduce your monthly payments and extend the life of the loan, your balance just kept going up and up and up and up and up. And people were ending, like, you would actually pay your original loan balance several times over before you got to the 20-year mark. And then what was left over was canceled. So it's like, it was just, it was like not the greatest thing. And so part of that is hopefully going to be solved. So that gets into one avenue. But what we really do is we need to get Congress to like do their job and pass a bill. Senator Sanders has a College for All bill that was based upon the compromise of language that him and then candidate Biden's teams came together on for the platform. And so I still think I'm on the team. So Senator Sanders' team introduced that bill, I believe, in March of last year, reintroduced it. And so we have people in Congress that are working on it. We just have to fight a whole lot of lobbyists. But
who lobbies? That's always the really interesting thing to me to peel back. I know just enough to know how things work, but who are the lobbyists against college loan affordability, I guess I'll call it, much less free college?
So there's these. So you have the association. You have a group of private colleges that have an entity. You have the public colleges have an entity. The for-profit colleges have an entity. The loan companies, they have a lobby shop too. So you have all of these groups, and then you have banks that are involved. So you might have heard of the Super Bowl was played at SoFi Stadium, and SoFi is a bank that takes federal loans and then you refi them to private so they can make money off of them. So you have a lot of people that can make money off of this. And so they get paid a lot of money to try to stop this. And they'll argue and they'll say that, they'll go to say, for example, in Pennsylvania, they'll say, you have so many private colleges that if you do something on free college, you're going to be hurting your workers, your economic base. So there's just a lot of what they're working on. Same as like SoFi was lobbying during this whole process to be that you shouldn't cancel at all. We still, just take away the poorest people, because they wanted to keep the folks with the highest credit ratings in the federal loan pool. So then they're already starting to advertise. Like, people are texting me Facebook ads about, you need to, now is the time to lock in a low interest rate to refi your loan, which, like, on the ad, the fine print isn't there to say, if you refi today, you lose your ability for cancellation. And if I were someone who was, making a good amount of money and in the federal loan system, I would never refi to private, because you lose the ability for any kind of future help. And if you're in the kind of tax bracket and credit rating to be able to go to the private, just pay a little bit more every month on your federal as a way to save a bit of money, but like never leave the federal system. Don't let those vultures take your money.
Oh man, maybe we should just do a segment with parents like ours who are, about to send their kids to college with you, where you can give us some quick info on what to look out for if you do decide to borrow money, or how to afford and all of it. I'd love to do that with you. But let me just get back to, the final argument, which is, I love Catherine Rampell. I've interviewed her several times. I think she's one of the best most moral writers on when it comes to economics in kind of mainstream media. She's at the Washington Post, which is a column. She's been a constant critic of conservative economics and Republican policy and in so many arenas. And I like her as a person, but she has written a piece at the Washington Post. It's getting a tremendous amount of attention, especially from conservatives, because it's her writing it. It's titled, Biden's Student Debt Plan is a Democratic Version of Trickle-Down Economics. And I just want to read one part of it and get your response to it, because I think this is the part that would probably resonate with most, staunch progressives like me, when she writes just kind of the idea, I'll just paraphrase the intro here without reading it all, that, hey, this money could have been better spent on other things that progressives, much less most Americans, care about. And so she writes, Biden's student debt forgiveness plan also costs more than Congress just appropriated for climate change or on fighting child poverty through the expanded child tax credit, or on almost any other issue progressives usually claim to care about. It's also more than cancels out all the deficit reduction Biden just achieved through the Inflation Reduction Act. You are a staunch progressive. You care deeply about the other issues that she mentioned here, as well as obviously the student loan issue, student loan forgiveness. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, that's something we hear from a lot of people. And a lot of it, I call them the people that are arguing in bad faith, because and they're smart enough. They know the mechanisms of government. You have to appropriate new funds to do the child tax credit, to do pre-K4. And I was out there. I spent most of last year working to pass the Reconciliation Act, known as Build Back Better. And I did not see this moral outrage when No Labels and the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget were out there doing everything they could do to get Manchin and Sinema to vote no. I mean, I was out there in the rain, in the snow, in the cold, trying to get this bill passed a year ago. And they weren't out there making the ruckus about this. And so we had a mechanism for that. And the powers that be amongst the corporate class in D.C. did everything they could do to get Manchin and Sinema to be against passing the House version of Build Back Better, which is how we ended up with, this is great. I'm really glad that we got a compromise done. We needed to start doing things, and it's good to get this money now for climate. It is great to get this money for drug cost reduction, lowering the price of drugs. Right. So I'm really glad that the Inflation Reduction Act passed in early August. But this is separate. So this is money that's already out there that we have the legal authority to do via actions at the Department of Education. And I would just hope that all these people that are having this faux outrage over the idea of what about kids in poverty, go and tell the Congress to be pass. So then you can do another Reconciliation Act starting October 1st. And so I would hope that they're out there saying that the first thing Congress should do after the elections is pass Reconciliation 3. They can easily in November pass paid childcare, paid leave, pre-K4, free college, expand the child tax credit. We can do all of that. We haven't, if they are just out there and say, hey, we need to do this. That's the obstruction on this, is that we have a mechanism to do that. And Congress didn't do it. And the president and the Secretary of Education used the authority they had to help 43 million people. And to be clear, as we saw with the Pell Grant, the supermajority of these people they're helping of individuals are people who grew up in poverty. So all this stuff about what about kids in poverty? Spoiler, kids in poverty grow up and become adults. Are they no longer in need to have stability?
Really, really well said. And simpler said, what I heard you say was, you can take a figure of money in this case and say it could have been better spent over here, but if you don't have the option to do that, meaning what you're saying is all these other actions that she's talking about and other progressives are talking about or anybody's talking about take congressional approval. Mm-hmm. And we know at this point, after 2 years of this Congress, what we can get through and what we can't, what the House has passed and what obviously can't get through the Senate, because the House has passed a lot of progressive policy. So it's really maybe the Senate. But in this case, Biden, the executive branch, because of the way the power is, well, you can explain it better, but the Department of Education has the ability to do this. So he could do this. It was a matter of what could be done to help people through the executive branch This is what I'm trying to say, or versus what, could be done through the legislative branch. And that is true even in states on other issues. That's what I'm hearing.
Exactly. And I mean, Congress could have acted on this. Like, Congress could have sent the president a bill on his first day in office to get rid of student loan debt and make college free. Congress made that choice not to. And the president gave them a lot of time. I mean, he was sworn in, 18 months ago, 19 months ago. And so he gave them a lot of time. And in the meantime, we were very lucky because of the pause. And I think that's one part, maybe if I come back on again, talk about how the real reason why we're here today is because progressives smartly got the pause on student loan payments in March of 2020. And it's that pause on payments that really made
because of the pandemic
had to be inevitable. So that part, that played a really huge role in this as well.
Right. The pause was as a result of COVID, the pandemic, nobody being able to, right?
They just kept extending it because no one wants to be the one that turns this back on.
What do you say to the accusation of pandering? Biden and Democrats did this to basically buy the vote of anybody who now has been relieved of their debt.
I just laugh in Trump tax cuts.
Right. So finally, and there's so many other things we can say, I just want to get your take, your general take on this plan. It's certainly not everything you wanted, but you seem like, as much as you are a very, I'm not going to say unforgiving, but passionate activist and thinker, and you care about this issue, it seems that you still don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But maybe I've got your reaction wrong. So how do you feel about what just took place? It also sounds like you're celebrating in a way all these 10, 12 years of work.
I know. So one, we ran through the tape. So we were demanding full cancellation with no means testing, basically up until the announcement was made official. And, we're still demanding that. But you can take a moment to be like, this is basically, I joke around that, this is basically in one stroke of the pen, Biden just completely destroyed 50 years of Washington consensus on higher education. So even before the cancellations happened to people, destroying Washington consensus is huge. And getting over that inertia is really huge. So just that in itself is a huge win. 20 million people having all of their debt taken away is life-changing. It's amazing. And then having a huge relief for the rest of the folks. And now we won that argument. Government can cancel student loan debt. We don't have to have student loan debt. So now we just have to, I joke around that, okay, celebrate round one. We're going to do round two. But people are really tired right now. So we're just going to hold off on the round two talk until December. But
all right. Well, I thought of one more argument while you're talking there. So take this final one on, which is, listen, I'm a taxpayer and I don't want to have bailed you out. I just bailed you out, Melissa. I pay my taxes. Did taxpayers bail out folks who were in debt to these loans?
No, I mean, the money was already appropriated, and a lot of it was just interest, and a lot of it was loans that would be, if people did the IDR payments for another 15 to 20 years, would be canceled anyway. So you're basically just making it a more efficient process to get people to be able to get married, have kids, buy homes. So you taxpayer, you want to sell your home, you need someone that can afford these ridiculous rates. So.
Got it. Wow. What a conversation. Thank you so much. I learned so much in preparing to talk to you and even more in getting to talk to you and ask these questions. I can't wait to discuss any number of these threads that we discussed again and maybe have you on with a live group of listeners to ask more questions.
I would love to. This was so much fun.
Cool. Anything to plug, by the way, that I wouldn't have seen in any organizations or websites that you want to plug?
You can go to my website, cancelstudentdebt.org.
Yep.
And if you like a lot of really just incessant tweeting about canceling student loan debt, you can follow me at MCBYRNE.
Yeah. And I love your Twitter feed and it's great. So people should definitely follow you there. And hopefully you'll get a lot of new followers out of it. Folks, don't let me down out of this interview. Go follow Melissa.
It was so great to meet you. I had so much fun.
Great to meet you too. Thank you so much for talking to me. All right. There you go. Melissa Byrne on Twitter at MC Byrne. Go follow her. Of course, go follow Victor Eric Ray, my first guest you heard. Get his book. Thank you very much for listening to today's show all the way to the end. You all the way to the enders. Yeah. You guys are the very best. I really appreciate it. Let me know how I can make the show better, more succinct, funnier, more informative, more relatable, you name it. Love to hear from you. standupwithpete@gmail.com. Subscribe now at standupwithpete.com. Hope to see you at tonight's hangout if you're already a subscriber. Check us out. Hang out with us for as little as $5 a month. Go do it. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. I'm really good at talking here at the end. It's late. Good night, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for listening. Be the change you want to see. Welcome to September. I love you guys. Talk to you tonight. And I hope we get to see John Carroll tonight. Well, he's always here with us, taking us out.
All of us know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eyes. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear and all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.